Good morning, everybody. It's great to be with you this morning. I want to welcome our guests. We're glad that you're here. We hope that your time with us is a blessing to you. We're looking forward to celebrating Lowell's birthday after service. And if we have some strong men, I think we're going to be doing some setting up in the gym for the clothing giveaway this next weekend. And please, if you're able, come and help with that and touch base with Angela and Maynard and let them know how you can help and find out how you can help. I don't know if you've ever studied generations. It's an interesting field of study. It's a field with all sorts of different debates and questions in it. And one of the first questions that's asked and has to be settled is, well, when does a generation begin and end? That's probably one of the biggest debates within the field. There's a lot of different trains of thought as to kind of what defines a generation, but one field of thought is large events, those cultural events that take place that really shape a generation. Things like the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the assassination of JFK, the Space Shuttle's Columbia disaster, the Oklahoma City bombing, 9/11, or COVID-19. These kind of major events, the oldest one you can remember and you can kind of understand the way that the world changed, kind of is a defining landmark for a generation. So there's all sorts of debates as to when those begin and things, but those tend to be kind of the basic ones. Now, when you look at generations, the current generation is Gen Z, and they are 10 years old and up to about 26 right now. So that's kind of where things are. Now, one of the generations that gets a bad rap is the millennials. Those millennials, they're immature, they're eating Tide Pods, they're doing all sorts of crazy stuff. Anytime we talk about generations, I always like to point out I'm a millennial. Millennials are graduated from college, we have careers, we're probably married, maybe even have kids and are driving minivans. That's who the millennial generation are, but we get our fair shake. What's interesting, though, about this is nothing new. I was on the Sunset International Bible Institute's app, and they have all sorts of different archived sermons from the past, and I think, at a workshop back in like 1970, 1960 something, and there was a sermon about what are we going to do with the boomers? How are we going to keep the boomers in the church, and how are we going to motivate them to be active in the church, and how are we going to motivate and keep this generation? What I found funny about that was you could have switched out boomers for millennials, and it would have been the exact same sermon. I could have preached it this Sunday, and all of you would have been going, yeah, absolutely, how do we do that? This generational debate, this generational conflict is nothing new. Now, I don't bring this up to start a debate or a fight. I'm not saying that, oh, you boomers, or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. I'm bringing this up because it's important to understand that this is something that is as old as time. Israel lived in Egypt for many, many generations. 215 to 430 years they lived in Egypt under captivity, under the Pharaohs. And it really was a forming event for them. God comes to them. We've been looking at this. He saved them out of Egypt. With a mighty outstretched arm, He worked with these 10 plagues. He led them out of Egypt personally. He provided for their needs. He led them through the Red Sea. He led them to Mount Sinai. He dwelt with them. He helped them and guided them in how they were to build the tabernacle. And God led them to the Promised Land. And you would think that after all of those things, that the people would trust God, that the people would know that God is on our side. After all of those things, surely we now know, surely we now understand God is on our side. And yet, when that generation reached the promised land and went and explored and came back and said, yes, it's a wonderful, great land, but it's going to be difficult to take. Instead of believing this is an opportunity for God once again to show Himself strong, instead they said, God has brought us here to kill us and to subjugate our children. The result of that was 40 years in the desert. We often say that they wandered in the desert for 40 years, but that's not true. They were following God for 40 years. They were no more than a week's journey away from the promised land at any one time. And for 40 years, they followed God around the desert until a generation passed away. When we get to Deuteronomy, an entire generation plus has passed away. I want you to really think about that. Nobody who was younger than 19, other than Joshua and Caleb, were alive. An entire generation passed away. No one older than 59 years of age, other than Joshua and Caleb, would enter the promised land. That's quite a ceiling. There's all sorts of tropes around generations, right? The young generation is immature, and they're going to destroy what the older generation has built. The older generation isn't with the times, and they don't understand all the new technology, and they're just holding us back, and they're stifling us. Those are tropes, right? But I want us to stop and think as well about the things that formed these generations. One generation grew up in captivity, grew up in slavery. And they saw God come with a mighty outstretched arm and lead them out. But they always had that defining moment of slavery, that hardness of heart that was built within them from that. Another generation remembers Egypt, but most of their life was formed in the desert, following God, watching His miraculous, mighty right arm leading them out, providing for them, guiding them. This time the tropes were somewhat true. God judges a generation and says that generation is hard of heart. They will not learn, and they will pass away. They will not enter my rest. An entire generation passes away because of their hardness of heart. They wouldn't follow. A generation unworthy of following in the footsteps of. I want you to think about that. A generation arises that knows that they should not follow in the footsteps of their parents or their grandparents. That's a tough pill to swallow. And yet, ultimately, they make the same mistake of the generation before them. Deuteronomy means the regiving of the law. It's the regiving, the retelling of the law. Why did Moses need to regive or retell the law? Because an entire generation arose that did not know the law. They spent 40 years in the desert, following God, having everything they needed provided for them, though they didn't like the variety that was provided. Learning to trust God. What did they have to do other than study the law, other than know the commandments of God? And a generation arises that does not know the Lord. And the sad fact of the matter is, the generation that arises makes the same mistake as their fathers and their grandfathers. Because after Joshua's generation passes away and the leadership that is surrounding Joshua passes away, a generation once again arises that does not know the Lord. Let that sink in. A generation arises that does not know the Lord. One of the first mistakes we see as we look at this generation that takes the promised land. It leads to the period of the judges, best described as everyone does what is right in their own eyes. a cycle of rebellion, crying out to God, God saving them, and once again rebellion. Over and over and over again. All of it could be prevented if the people had simply listened. Moses stands before the people in the re-giving of the law and says, Shema, listen up. Deuteronomy 6, love God with everything that you are. Love Him with every ounce of your being. Live it out. Practice it. Live out your faith. Be a living example to your children and teach them. Teach them as you go throughout life. When you're lying down, when you rise up, bind the law upon your gates. Have it as frontlets between your eyes. If that generation had simply shemad, if they'd simply listened, if they'd simply done this, a generation would have arose that knew the Lord. It's a simple thing. 3 generations. This principle holds out in all sorts of ways, but we'll keep it in the concept of faith at the moment. What is a matter of conviction for the first generation, if not properly passed on, becomes a matter of tradition for the second generation, and then becomes a matter of inconvenience for the third. The passing along of faith is so important. Now, there's no guarantee that the next generation will follow in your footsteps. We see that. But the best chance we have at passing along our faith is the authenticity of living out our faith in an open and honest way. Dealing with the mistakes that we make, being honest about the mistakes that we make, and seeking to do better. Loving God with every ounce of our being, and living out that example before their eyes. Being a living example of what it looks like to be a Christian. And then teaching them the faith. Because faith is caught. It's not taught. It begins with what we see. It begins with what we experience. It's important to understand the doctrine. It's important to study the Scriptures. But it begins with the example lived out before us. The people of Israel follow Joshua across the river, and the first obstacle in their way is Jericho. Jericho is a formidable problem. Large, thick walls, double-walled city. It's a formidable defensive structure. It is the first obstacle in their way. So how will they take it? How will they take the land? So Joshua follows somewhat in the footsteps of Moses and sends out just 2 spies this time. They come back with the report that the city is scared. God has put the fear of Him in the people. Well, that's good news. The city's locked up tight. That's probably good news. But Joshua still doesn't know how he's going to take the land. How do we take Jericho? How do we deal with this problem? So Joshua does what any commander does. He goes and he overlooks the problem. He surveys the issue. And he runs into an interesting fellow. In Joshua chapter 5, starting in verse 13, when Joshua was by Jericho, he lifted up his eyes and he looked, and behold, a man was standing before him with his drawn sword in his hand. Joshua went to him and said, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" Now there is a logical and reasonable question to ask in such a situation. And he said, "No. But I am the commander of the army of the Lord, and now I have come." Did you catch it? Joshua asked this reasonable question, right? He sees a man of war standing before him, somebody with a sword drawn, and he draws near to him, and he asks a very reasonable question. Whose side are you on? Are you on my side, or are you on the side of my enemy? You don't want to assume either of those, right? You don't want to assume you're standing before a foe and you don't come prepared, nor do you want to assume you're standing before a friend and it actually be a foe, right? Neither one of those options is good. So he asks a reasonable question. And we learn that this is the commander of the Lord's army. This is the angel of the Lord, the general of God, standing before Joshua. So is God and His general with Joshua? Isn't the obvious answer yes? Didn't a generation pass away in the desert because they came to the promised land and they didn't believe that God was with them? Isn't the angel of the Lord with Joshua? But that's not the answer that the angel gives. He says, no, I'm not with either side. I'm not with either side. There's an important lesson to be learned here. A very important lesson to be learned here. We tend to think about things in context of who's on my side, right? If I have God on my side, then I can't lose. I want God to pick my side. But who's God? Who is God? Is He not the great I am? The existing one, the unchanging one? Is that not who our God is? So is our God going to change and pick our side? No. He's not going to pick our side. God's unchanging. God doesn't pick sides. The question is not whose side is the angel of the Lord on. It's obvious. He's on God's side. The question is, whose side is Joshua on? Joshua, are you on your own side or are you on God's side? Whose side are you on? Whose side will you pick? Who will you follow? I had a conversation once with Maynard here in the building after church. We were talking about the Bible and doctrine. And he made an interesting comment. He said, I want to follow the Bible. Whatever it says, I want to do it. And I want to attend a church, and I want to go to a church that's doing what the Bible says. And if I ever find a church that does that better, I want to go to that church. And I told Maynard, absolutely. I want to go with you. If you find a church that serves God better than this church, let me know and I'll go with you. Isn't that the heart of what is being said here? Whose side are you on? Are you on God's side? Do you want to do His will? Do you want to follow His instructions, or do you want God to bless what you decide to do? Whose side are you on? The battle at Jericho will answer that question for many people. Whose side are you on? Are you on your own side, or are you on God's side? The angel of the Lord gives some interesting instructions to Joshua. Here's how you're going to take the city. Get everybody out, go walk around the city, do a lap once every day for 6 days. On the seventh day, walk around the city 7 times. Oh yeah, don't say anything. Silence. When you finally complete that 7th lap on that 7th day, yell. Honestly, this is the approach that most people take on Facebook. They say lots of things, and then they yell, and they expect that, your argument's going to fall apart, right? I think the VeggieTales really got this right? Keep walking, because you won't knock down our wall. Keep walking, but it isn't going to fall. It's plain to see your brains are very small to think walking will be knocking down our wall. Keep going, guys. Keep walking. But it's not a very effective strategy. But the wisdom of God is foolishness to the world. Whose side are you on? Israel made laps day after day. And the question was, whose side are you on? In the end, Rahab and her family that stayed in her house said, we're on God's side. And they lived. But the rest of the city was devoted to destruction. The rest of the city was devoted to God. God won the victory that day. All Israel did was walk around a wall. That doesn't knock down walls. Yelling at a wall doesn't bring it down. But God does. God does. So Rahab chose God's side. Whose side did Israel choose? Well, the Battle of Ai kind of answers that question. It would seem that that Israel chose God's side. They were victorious. And fresh off that victory, they see this small town of Ai. It's the next obvious objective. They go and they search it out. We're going to repeat everything from the first attack, right? We go and we sight out the town. Oh, this one will be easy. We don't all have to go. We'll go and we'll fight. And they go and they fight and they lose. And they come back and they go, why? What happened? Why did we lose this battle? They kind of mope around a little bit, and then finally God answers. Well, there's three reasons. There's three reasons why Israel lost this battle. One, they thought that God was on their side. They didn't choose to be on God's side. They assumed that God was with them. This led to the second problem. They didn't pray. They didn't seek God's face. They assumed God was with them. They had just won a major victory, and they marched out to the next battlefield. God's with us. We can't lose. We'll go. They never stopped to pray. They never stopped to seek God's face. They simply see a problem before them. They know that God's on their side, and they go. But if they had stopped and prayed, God would have saved them the trouble and let them know of the third problem, that there was sin in the camp. There was sin in the camp. When God reveals this fact, they go and they find Achan, they deal with him, and then God gives them another battle plan, and they're able to defeat Ai. We see here that the generation that took the promised land was not perfect. They weren't perfect. They didn't make the right decisions all the time. They made mistakes. They failed to seek God's face. They failed to ask His direction. Achan stole the devoted things of God from Jericho. He chose his own side. And as a result, the whole group suffered. So they stole the devoted things of God, they didn't seek God's favor, and they failed to pass along their faith. That was one of the first things we saw this morning. A generation after them arises. They failed to pass along their faith, and the period of the judges begins. Joshua, at the end of his life, as he is getting ready to pass on to his reward, stands up much like Moses does. And he gives the people a choice. He says, you need to choose. Who are you going to serve? Whose side are you going to be on? Are you going to be on God's side? Or are you going to choose the gods of those that you have defeated? The gods that were worshipped in the towns you now dwell in, the houses you now live in. Whose side are you on? And Joshua makes that bold assertion. You have a choice to make, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. This morning, I hope you will choose as Joshua chose, and as the people of Israel chose that day. We will serve the Lord. It's a clear choice, isn't it? He's the one who parted the Red Sea. He's the one who freed them from Egypt. He's the one who led them through the desert. He's the one who gave them victory in the promised land. We choose God's side. But it's easier said than done. They failed to Shema. They failed to love God with everything that they are. They failed to live out their faith in a way that was then caught by the next generation. They failed to leave the next generation a faith that they would follow in, because then a generation arises that does not know the Lord. How does that happen? How does that happen? So as Christians, The takeaway for us this morning is to renew our attempt to be honest in the way that we live out our faith. That we live out our faith as best we can. We love God with everything that we are. We seek to do better when we fail. We live out our faith before our children. And we teach them as we go through life how to serve the Lord, what His commandments are. We seek to pass on our faith. That's what we seek to do, because we see the importance of passing along that faith. But if you're not a Christian this morning, maybe you have questions about this Bible, what it means. You're unsure how to live out your faith. You're unsure how to begin that relationship with God. Well, that's why we're here. We want to help you answer those questions. We want to bring you to the Word of God. We want to open it up and let it speak for itself. We want to help you learn God's side. And we want to join you, and we want you to join us in being on God's side. If you have studied those things and you know what it means to be a Christian, the water behind me is ready. And if you're ready to die to yourself and to live for Him and to be washed clean and to begin anew, the water's ready. Or maybe you have questions and you want to study. We're here for you there as well. Or maybe you need encouragement as you seek to live out and pass on your faith. And we're here for you in that regard as well. So however we can assist you this morning in your walk of faith, we invite you to come as we stand and as we sing.